Okay, so this session we're going to talk about how climate change makes food production a little bit more expensive, and ultimately it's you and I as the consumers who will actually have to pay those higher prices. So if we think about food production, we're talking about production of wheat, which goes into bread and pasta, meat, fruit and vegetables, these sorts of products. Now, how much we can produce of these depends very much on climate. So if you've got the ideal temperature, good rainfall, good sunlight, that makes the food crops grow really well. But different plants require different mixtures of rainfall, temperature and sunlight. And so we find rice, for example, wanting lots and lots of water and lots of sunshine. Wheat, on the other hand, can survive with a lot less rain, and we then have different types of wheat that require, say, 200 days of sunlight, and some can get away with 100 days of sunlight. So there's massive variation across different plants. It also depends on soil fertility. So we've got some soils with lots of minerals and stuff that makes plants grow, and other soils that are fairly infertile. So that's important. Technology, so what sort of genetic material we've got, what sort of equipment we've got to harvest stuff on time and to get maximum yield. And of course, farmers are very sophisticated people. Agriculture is sometimes described as a sunset industry. I like to think of it as a sunrise industry. People are having to work with changes in climate, with changes in soil, with changes in what people want to eat. And these farmers are pretty smart at adapting to those changes. And of course it depends on other inputs like fertiliser and the quality of machinery and labour. So then we can ask ourselves, how does climate change affect our ability to grow food? Well, temperature is really important, and what we know is that climate change is going to raise temperatures. And that, in some cases, will mean we can't grow food in some places because it's now too hot. In other places, it'll turn out that it was too cold before, and now it's actually a success story. Rainfall, either direct falling on plants or running into rivers or into artesian and then extracted for irrigation, is very important. The length of the growing period is another important climatic variable. And of course the frequency and magnitude of severe weather events. There are many crops, for example, that are not frost tolerant. So if you get a frost, you lose the crop. There are others that if you get a very hot period, like fruit, the fruit will be burnt, and you and I don't like eating discoloured fruit. So that affects productivity. On the plus side with climate change is a build-up of carbon dioxide. And what plant growth is all about is converting CO2, carbon dioxide, with water and with minerals from the soil into productive plant growth. And so an increase in greenhouse gases actually will have a sort of positive. So if we look at the whole story, climate change means that the temperature, the available water, the sort of magnitude of adverse events is going to shift over time. And that's going to make the plants that we've now grow find life pretty tough, and they won't produce quite as much. But it may make life attractive for new plants. And so what we have to do is adapt to that climate change. Now there are some other future challenges facing the food sector. If we look in the next 20 or 50 years ahead, we're going to have a much larger and wealthier population. So it's estimated that the global population is going to increase from about 7 billion people now to 9 billion people by 2050. And most of that growth will be in the developing world. But also, as people's income rise, they tend to shift away from very carbohydrate intensive, very much rice and wheat-based products, and they start to like some proteins, some meats, some milk and dairy products. And it takes more to produce these high protein products rather than the natural carbohydrates. So people like the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimate that we will need to increase food production by about 70% by 2050. That's a big increase in food production. And even then, of those 7 billion people we have in the world now, nearly 1 billion are undernourished. And that's not something that anybody wants to sustain into the future. So we have some real challenges. Then life is tough. Are we going to produce all this extra food? Well, the space on the earth is pretty much fixed. And apart from some areas in Latin America, we've pretty much used up all the land that's suitable for agricultural production. So we're going to have to produce this extra food on roughly the same area of land. And we'll probably have less water. So that means we've got a big increase in demand for food. Some of our key resources are nearly fixed. What's the solution? Well, we've got to raise productivity. And we've got to do it in a world in which there's climate change. So what if we don't adjust and maintain our current practices? Well, because of climate change, plants that now, wheat plants, apples and so on, that now grow quite well, won't grow quite as well. And it's estimated that production might fall by as much as 10%. So less food production. So if less food production, how are we going to ration that amongst those 5 to 7 billion people around the world? Well, the price of food is going to rise. Now, for people in the developed world who have very high incomes and spend less than 20% of their income on food, that's not going to be a great problem. But if you're in a poor country and you're spending 50 to 80% of your income on food and prices go up, then that 1 billion people who are now malnourished will go up even further. And that's not a happy scenario. The poor people as being less nourished, their health is going to fall, their ability to look after themselves, their productivity falls. That's a depressing direct effect. But even for those of us who are pretty well off and will be able to pay the higher price, there's going to be a lot more people who are undernourished, complaining about inadequate food, with political discontent. The Arab Spring of 2012 is an example of what goes wrong when the bottom part of the population are not well looked after. So if we don't adjust to climate change, that's a pretty horrible scenario. And that's what we would call a cost of climate change. So what's a better scenario? Well, we should try and adapt. So that means in some cases we're going to have to shift the area of production. So we're going to have to move, in some cases, wheat production, rice production further north or south to find the climate where it works really well. Or we're going to have to change our production systems. So in particular, we'll change variety. So some areas that now grow rice may move into growing wheat. Some areas that will grow crops in the summer may go out of production. Other areas that are now growing crops in the winter will grow more crops in the summer. The big action, of course, is going to be investment in new and better technology. And in particular, that means new genetic material. We're going to have to find plants, say, if you take the case of the Australian wheat belt, that's going to be hotter and drier under most projections. We're then going to have to develop varieties that can survive with less water and can withstand greater heat, produce the same product. Now, I'm pretty confident that our scientists can do that job. But this stuff doesn't come for free. We've got to invest in that science. We've got to encourage farmers to change their production systems. These are some of the costs of adaptation to climate change. We can do it, but we have to change our ways.